November's NSDA Public Forum topic is going to be Resolved on Balance, the benefits of genetically modified foods outweigh the harms. Like the previous topic for September and October, the wording kind of goes away from the topic area. Just like subsidies steered us from sports to municipal finance, genetically modified foods is steering us away from agriculture and towards health in ways that are going to impact which arguments are actually viable on the topic versus which arguments sound like they should be at first glance. So let's start with the wording, move from there into some of the common arguments, from there into balance, and from there into what each team needs to do. On balance, fairly straightforward. You'll notice there isn't a limiting phrase such as in the US this time around. It's a much broader on balance. If one side wins that genetically modified foods are good for the US, but the other side wins that they are harmful to developing countries around the world, that side is probably going to win. So keep that in mind when looking at the scope of your impacts as well as the magnitude for a particular area. It talks about benefits of the foods versus benefits of the crops or benefits of the livestock. And this is where the topic gets a little bit tricky. It does not say GMOs, it does not say genetically modified crops. Those would be terms of art. Genetically modified foods is much more open to interpretation. Many pro teams are going to speculate that if the framers wanted argument X to be included in the topic, they would have spoken about the crops or the engineering process or GMOs as a whole, rather than specifically foods. Choosing foods narrows the debate, and it does so in a way that helps pro and hurts con. Because many of the con arguments are not about the foods themselves so much as the circumstances under which they are grown. Obviously, outweighing the harms is fairly straightforward. Genetically modified foods probably means GMOs, probably means gene splicing. It could be used to mean a couple other things as well, though. Most likely, it is not talking about attempting to create mutations through radiation. Most likely, it is not talking about attempting to breed selectively. It's probably talking about what companies like Monsanto and Syngenta do, where either through just shooting metal bits in or using particularly engineered bacterium, they insert sequences of genetic code into a food. That's not the only thing it can mean, but it's probably what it's going to mean on balance anyway for the purposes of this round. The vast majority of the corn grown in the United States is genetically modified. The vast majority of wheat is not. The vast majority of soybeans are. Other crops are kind of up in the air. Genetically modified tomatoes were the first crops approved for use. There aren't any genetically modified livestock approved yet. That said, it's worth mentioning that potential harms from things that are not approved yet could still be used by con. They'll just have to do a little more framework work to get at them. This topic is tricky to debate directly on health for the con team. Generally speaking, most evidence from credible sources that con would like to use does not say that on balance these harms exist. It says there hasn't been enough studies done just yet. So many of them are saying we need more studies in case harms exist that would outweigh the benefits, not on balance known harms of these outweigh anything. Which means that very often con is going to want to focus the debate on the secondary effects of the crops rather than the benefits versus the harms of the food, if pro will let them. The good news is that con has a greater variety of ways to win on this topic, but pro has more reliable ways to win. This is one of those topics where there is an expert consensus towards one side. The vast majority of the people who have done studies are concluding pro on this topic. from a purely nutritional science standpoint. That said, con authors can certainly argue that people who would do studies that would disprove this are not being granted access to these crops and are being blocked from doing said studies. But at the same time, that's still not proving an on balance harm. It is simply disputing that the benefit might be as great as it currently seems to be on balance. When we're talking about the benefits on balance, Pro wants to talk about this in terms of what it can do for starvation in developing countries, what it can do for making crops able to be developed in places that otherwise couldn't support them, what it can do for getting greater yields from areas, what it can do from not needing to use external pesticides, or what it can do from making them pesticide resistant to avoid having crops lost to pests. There's a lot of things that Pro can talk about here if they want to, but at the same time, it's an area that Con is certainly going to be prepared to play defense on. Smart Con teams are going to talk about this not so much in terms of is starvation a problem, but is it a problem of scarcity versus a problem of logistics, a problem of resource allocation? Do we have enough food to feed everybody anyway? And the solution isn't more crops, the solution is just better distribution. Keep in mind that a lot of the crops that are grown in the US and are potentially edible never are eaten. Many are just grown for the sake of subsidies and then discarded, turned into biofuels, used as carbon sinks, what have you. But it's not necessarily the same kind of situation as just there would not be enough food without these, and there is with. At the same time, in most rounds, Pro is probably going to win a risk of offense. They are going to win. There is fewer kinds of crops that can be given to different people without this, and even if crops could be given as supplies, the ability to grow them yourselves in a climate you otherwise could not grow them, or at a price point you otherwise could not grow them at, makes them more affordable, lowers food prices, and has lots of secondary benefits besides just direct avoidance of starvation in terms of just greater nutrition, greater diet variety, greater food autonomy, all of that. So that's where Pro is starting with. At the same time, there's certainly countries which have largely growing population, big agricultural issues, but are certainly reluctant to use genetically modified crops. India is probably the biggest example of this. That said, part of this isn't motivated by the crops themselves, which is motivated by the policies of and intellectual property laws regarding these GM crops. And one thing that is not doing the pro side any favors is that the companies that are marketing these crops to developing countries are frankly kind of evil in the way they go about things and not really doing themselves any real favors. On the one hand, you have companies arguing that these don't cause any health risks, and it looks like the science is actually backing them up thus far. On the other hand, they're trying to fight against any labeling of them, which makes it look like they have something to hide, even if they are just thinking in short-term marketing goals. If they emphasized more that there wasn't any demonstrable drawback and went with labeling to show how widespread these actually are and how many times people in every country eat them anyway, then that would probably help a lot more than trying to fight against people knowing what they are eating while at the same time suing farmers for having their proprietary seeds blow into their property because the farmer next door is using them, and claiming that because of this, they are partly responsible for the farmer's new crop. Whether he wanted their seeds or not, the fact that he grew them next to them and they blew in now means that they owe him. The other thing that can be an issue here is biodiversity, and this can take a couple forms. Let's talk about pesticides first. The idea here is that GM crops interact with pesticides in two ways. Some of them have pesticides in them, either in the edible parts of the plant or in other parts of the plant. Very often it's something that's synthesized from a fairly common pesticide found in caterpillars. The other option is ones that are glyphosate resistant, that don't that are not vulnerable to the same mechanism that many pesticides such as Roundup use that will kill other plants. so they'll synthesize it in slightly different ways. When you are looking at pesticides, the pro argument for the first one is this prevents overuse of pesticides because there's just enough in the plant to make it pest resistant anyway, so you don't really need to worry about it. The second one is saying you can spray more on this, or you can spray herbicides on this, and again, that's where the glyphosates and the Roundup comes in, and it will kill the other plants but leave these alive, so you need to be less careful with dosage. These are two different kinds of arguments. One involves building up a toxin in the plants, the other involves building up resistance to the toxin in pests. And each of these can have different ecological consequences depending on which one is winning this genetic arms race. If plants are being developed, if stronger pesticides are being developed at a faster rate, it can kill off the bugs who are pests to the plants, but can also kill off other bugs as well. If Khan is making this argument, they want to focus on the keystone species. They want to focus on species that, through their interaction with the plants, enable other species in the ecosystem to exist, honeybees being the prime example of this. On the other hand, if you're not talking about the species, you're talking about an arms race, you can talk about how this will cause super weeds to be developed, or this will cause other plants to evolve in a way that makes them even more resistant to the herbicides we have now, until we don't have any options that aren't blatantly toxic for human consumption to use. So one species that isn't keeping up with this genetic arms race is Homo sapiens sapiens. And at that point, the argument becomes less about the benefits of the foods themselves, so much as the ecological consequences of growing the crops. And again, it's really a question of framing. Can Khan tie this in to being a benefit or harm of the food? Or can Pro say, well, we're not really talking about that. There are plenty of ways that this could be grown responsibly. This isn't intrinsic to the resolution, and we should focus on whether the foods themselves are good or bad, not the crops that they come from. Livestock are probably not going to be a big part of this debate. Not counting the occasional fish gene found in your tomatoes, there aren't any GM livestock that are approved for human consumption anyway, so it's very hard to prove the benefits on balance are going, or the harms on balance are going to outweigh whoever wins the debate about crops, even though the debate doesn't specifically focus on crops in the wording, it does in implementation. There are some aquaculture instances where you will see transgenic fish being developed, but again, this isn't going to be something that really affects something on balance unless there are global biodiversity implications for livestock that do not exist for crops and therefore can outweigh them on a global level in terms of what impact that biodiversity has on the internal links to the other team's points. Okay. So, on Khan, there are a few things that you need to do on this topic. You need to have good impact defense early on. You definitely need to mitigate what Pro is talking about. Otherwise, it sounds like you're talking about wanting to have fancier, more expensive food in one country in exchange for people who don't have a choice between fancy food or less fancy food, it's just some food versus no food, from starving. So good impact defense doesn't narrow your scope to the US, and that does show how this isn't necessarily helping and might cause a net loss overall in the long term of food supply to these other countries. So how the apparent food autonomy from being able to grow food locally is actually impinged upon by the policies of Monsanto, of Syngenta, of other companies that patent and enforce patents for GM crops. Khan also needs to take advantage of the implicit bias in close and tied debates. A lot of judges, whether they admit it or not, are going to have some idea that there must be something worse about GM foods, partly because of how secretive the companies about them tend to be, partly just because we tend to think of it as the options are organic or GM, and the idea that there's some kind of middle ground there or some kind of overlap there is not something that most people are particularly comfortable with. Beyond that, there's just little details like the fact that, for instance, in the Monsanto cafeteria, they do serve organic, non-GMO food, so it certainly gives the impression that even these people who are pushing them and saying there are no harms must know something about them that we don't. So things otherwise being equal or tied, you're probably going to see judges going, it seems like there's something off about this. I might give Khan the benefit of the doubt. So Khan should be aware of that and be willing to take advantage of that in terms of, well, this is a little bit worse, so we might as well not do it. If they can show that supply is even without, or if they can show there's alternate causes for the harms that Pro claims that these solve for, or if they can show that there isn't really any crisis that needs GM food to solve for. Khan also wants to focus on biodiversity because even if it's not an impact of the food directly, the framing effort that Pro needs to put into defending it not being a consequence of putting this food on the table is certainly something that is still time well spent for Khan. And if Pro does not do that, then that can certainly be a bigger impact in the long term as long as you actually explain what impact biodiversity has overall rather than just, okay, fewer species, or okay, these crops are rare, or okay, non-GM crops will become hard to find, but more, these are the actual consequences of these kinds of likely extinctions. But generally speaking, Cobb wants to frame the debate to be about the crops and the companies more than the foods themselves. Their best health risk arguments are indirect and environmental, not risks to health from the consumption of GM food, because all the evidence that would like to conclude Khan on that is saying we need more evidence to know whether or not this is safe, not here is definite proof that this is unsafe in humans. For Pro, the opposite of this is generally the case. You don't need to spend too much time on Khan impact defense. You can spend a lot of times just unlinking stuff or arguing against it with framework. If the Khan team wants to make the debate just about the US, you want to make it as broad as you can. You want to talk about countries that this actually makes a major difference in. You want to divorce yourself from the companies that market these and talk about the benefits of the foods themselves. And when you are talking about biodiversity, the argument is probably going to be less focused on why these are good for that or why they don't have an impact on this, and more on the fact that this is just one other selective force out there, and that even if it was harmful, it wouldn't be harmful because of the foods themselves. The foods can still be beneficial even if the circumstances in which they are overgrown may be harmful. Pro wants to figure out which impacts they can concede and say don't prove the resolution false and which ones they need to fight on, both based on the Khan team's evidence and the judge's reactions. This is also a debate where vocabulary matters a lot on both sides. How you describe something is certainly going to influence the judge's perspective. Is it augmented? Is it tainted? Is it transgenic? Is it fortified? What do these terms actually mean? Does it integrate bug-repelling chemicals? Is it poisoned? Can something be organic if it's grown without pesticides but produces something pesticide-like in it? Is something that's herbicide resistant tougher and more resilient? Or is it built for a poisonous environment? Wording is going to matter a lot on this topic in working with a judge's implicit bias. Are people starving for lack of food? Or are people denied the choice to grow other food? Is this a situation we should trust a scientific consensus, or a situation where we should distrust a monopoly on corporate information? Wording on this topic matters more than it did on the previous topic, and probably more than it will in either of the potential 2 December topics. Think about how your authors describe things. If you're not sure whether a source does conclude pro or con that you find, looking at the synonyms they choose to use is probably a fairly good hint of which it is. There is a lot more that I could say on this topic, but I'm trying to strike a balance between general, strategic, technical, and concise, though concise probably has about 25 seconds left for that. If you have other questions about more specific arguments, certainly feel free to leave them in the comments or send them to me in a message, and I will try and address them in a follow-up. But for now, this should be a decent idea of where this argument is going to get its start. Good luck on the topic. Let me know if you have any questions. Hope this helped.